The lecture hall at Andromeda University's prestigious xenobiology department looked like someone had thrown a zoo, a science fiction convention, and a geometry textbook into a blender and hit puree. Professor Kelvac stood at the front of the room, all forearms gesticulating wildly as he adjusted his holographic display for the third time in 2 minutes. His species, the Vorthaki, were known for two things: their obsessive need to catalog everything in the universe, and their complete inability to operate simple technology without making it unnecessarily complicated. "Students, today we embark on a journey through the galaxy's most terrifying predators," Kelvac announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of academic pomposity and genuine excitement that only comes from someone who has spent way too much time thinking about things that could eat you. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lighting, as he puffed out his thorax with pride. The classroom itself was a testament to galactic diversity and poor interior design choices. Floating meditation pods accommodated the gaseous Nebulon students, while reinforced titanium benches held the rock-based granitoids. The insectoid buzzlings hung from specially installed ceiling perches, occasionally dropping bits of their molted shells onto the students below, much to everyone's disgust. In the third row, wedged between a 7-foot-tall crystal being who communicated entirely through color changes and a sentient fungus that smelled suspiciously like old cheese, sat Jake Martinez. He was the only human in a classroom of 43 beings, and he had earned quite the reputation in his 6 months at Andromeda University. Jake had originally applied for the exchange program because, and this is a direct quote from his application essay, "Earth food is getting boring and I heard alien cafeterias have better variety." The admissions board had apparently mistaken this for deep philosophical curiosity about interspecies cultural exchange. They were wrong, but Jake wasn't about to correct them, as long as the cafeteria kept serving those purple things that tasted like pizza and made his tongue tingle. The other students had learned to both fear and anticipate Jake's contributions to class discussions. He had a disturbing habit of asking questions that seemed innocent, but inevitably led to 20-minute tangents about Earth customs that left everyone more confused than when they started. Last week, he had derailed an entire lecture on symbiotic relationships by asking if anyone wanted to hear about something called marriage. Professor Kelvac had tried to ignore Jake's raised hand for the first month of classes, but the human had a persistence that bordered on weaponized annoyance. Plus, there was something unsettling about the way Jake would just sit there, hand in the air, staring directly at him with those weird binocular eyes until acknowledged. It was like being watched by a patient predator, which was ironically fitting, given today's topic. "Now, before we begin," Kelvac continued, shooting a preemptive warning glare at Jake, "I want to establish some ground rules. We are discussing actual apex predators, not Earth's domesticated animals, recreational activities, or bizarre mating rituals. This is serious xenobiology, not story time." Jake nodded solemnly, his expression the picture of innocence. Several students shifted nervously in their seats, pods or whatever passed for furniture in their particular cases. They had seen that look before. It never ended well for Professor Kelvac's lesson plans. The crystalline being next to Jake shifted through several shades of amber, which roughly translated to "here we go again" in her species' color-based language. The fungus student released a small puff of spores that smelled distinctly like popcorn, which was his species' equivalent of settling in for entertainment. In the back row, a buzzling named Chirp Click Whir began taking bets on how long the professor would last before Jake completely derailed the lecture. The current odds were heavily favored toward less than 15 minutes, with a few optimistic souls betting on a full 20 minutes of actual academic content. Professor Kelvac cleared his throat, which in Vorthaki involved a sound like grinding coffee beans mixed with a dying air conditioner. "Today, we shall explore the galaxy's most feared predators, beginning with the shadow stalkers of Vega Prime and culminating with the legendary void hunters of the Epsilon Sector." Jake's hand twitched slightly, but remained on his desk. Several students held their breath. "These creatures represent the pinnacle of evolutionary perfection in the art of hunting and killing," Kelvac continued, warming to his favorite subject. "They are the ultimate expression of nature's desire to create the perfect killing machine." Jake's eyes lit up with that particular gleam that made Professor Kelvac's antennae twitch with dread, but the human remained silent, apparently content to let the lecture proceed. For now, Professor Kelvac activated his holographic display with the kind of dramatic flourish that suggested he had practiced this moment in front of a mirror. The air above the lecture podium shimmered and coalesced into a three-dimensional nightmare that made half the class instinctively reach for whatever passed for weapons in their respective cultures. "Behold," Kelvak intoned, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an ominous whisper but actually sounded more like a malfunctioning garbage disposal. The Shadow Stalker of Vega Prime. The hologram showed a creature that looked like someone had taken a panther, fed it nothing but protein powder and rage for 6 months, then strapped chainsaws to its feet. Its obsidian fur seemed to absorb light itself, and its eyes glowed with the kind of malevolent intelligence that suggested it not only wanted to eat you, but had already planned out the most psychologically traumatic way to do it. The Shadow Stalker, Kelvak continued, clearly in his element now, can phase through solid matter at will, has reflexes faster than most species' nervous systems can process, and produces a neurotoxin so potent that its prey often dies from fear alone before the creature even touches them. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. Even the granitoids, who were literally made of rock and generally considered fearless, made nervous grinding sounds. Jake nodded appreciatively and jotted something down in his notebook. Several students craned their necks to see what he was writing, but his handwriting looked like it had been created by a drunk spider having a seizure. Next, Kelvak said, warming to his subject as he switched to a new hologram, we have the Razor Beast of Titan 7th. This creature looked like the unholy offspring of a grizzly bear and a Swiss Army knife. Every inch of its body was covered in retractable titanium claws. Its hide was apparently made of some kind of natural armor plating, and its roar could shatter reinforced glass at 300 meters. The Razor Beast, Kelvak explained with obvious relish, has been known to hunt entire space cruisers. It can survive in the vacuum of space for up to 6 hours, and has been observed using tools to breach hull plating. There are recorded instances of these creatures learning to operate airlocks. The fungus student released another spore cloud, this one smelling distinctly like anxiety sweat. The buzzlings in the ceiling began making nervous chittering sounds that translated roughly to nope, nope, nope in 17 different dialects. Jake raised his eyebrows and made another note. This time a few students caught a glimpse of what looked like a question mark, followed by several exclamation points. And finally, Professor Kelvak said, building to what he clearly considered his grand finale, the Void Hunter of the Epsilon Sector. The new hologram made the previous creatures look like cuddly pets. The Void Hunter was essentially a living nightmare wrapped in tentacles and bad intentions. It had no fixed form, existing as a constantly shifting mass of dark energy and malevolent purpose. Where it had eyes, there were instead tears in space-time itself, and its mere presence seemed to make reality uncomfortable. The Void Hunter, Kelvak said, his voice now hushed with genuine awe and terror, exists partially outside our dimension. It can manipulate gravity, time, and space itself. It feeds on the life force of entire planets and has been known to hunt starships across multiple galaxies for the simple pleasure of the chase. The classroom had gone completely silent except for the nervous breathing, whirring, crystalline chiming, and various other respiratory equivalents of 43 terrified students. He's, my students, represent the absolute pinnacle of predatory evolution, Kelvak concluded, puffing himself up with academic pride. In all my years of study, across all the documented species in our galaxy, these creatures stand alone as the ultimate expression of nature's capacity for creating perfect killing machines. Jake's hand had begun to twitch more noticeably. The crystalline being next to him had shifted to a deep red color that roughly translated to incoming disaster. Several buzzlings had begun quietly placing additional bets on the exact moment Jake would interrupt. These predators have shaped the evolution of countless civilizations, Kelvak continued, apparently oblivious to the growing tension in the room. They represent fears so primal, so fundamental, that they exist in the nightmares of species that have never even encountered them. Jake's hand rose about 2 inches off his desk before he caught himself and forced it back down. A bead of sweat appeared on his forehead. There is no creature in the known galaxy that can match their combination of intelligence, adaptability, and pure predatory instinct, Kelvak declared with finality. Jake's hand shot up like it was spring-loaded. Professor Kelvak's 4 eyes swiveled toward Jake's raised hand, with the kind of resignation usually reserved for natural disasters and tax audits. The entire classroom held its collective breath, which, in the case of the gaseous Nebulon students, created an interesting atmospheric pressure situation that made everyone's ears pop. Yes, Martinez, Kelvak said, his voice carrying the weary tone of a being who had already accepted his pedagogical doom. I suppose you have a question about Earth's, what was it last time? Recreational face-punching? Boxing, Professor, and no, that's not what I wanted to ask about, Jake replied with the kind of innocent smile that had probably gotten him in trouble since kindergarten. I was just wondering about your criteria for apex predators? Several students exchanged glances. This sounded almost reasonable, which was somehow more terrifying than Jake's usual opening gambits. My criteria are based on established xenobiological parameters, Kelvac replied cautiously, like a man defusing a bomb while blindfolded. Size, strength, intelligence, adaptability, and predatory success rate. Right, that makes sense, Jake nodded thoughtfully. But I'm curious about something. You said these represent the ultimate predators in the galaxy. But what about angry chihuahuas? The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational field. Professor Kelvac's antennae twitched in what might have been confusion or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. What? Kelvac said slowly. About what now? Chihuahuas, Jake repeated helpfully. You know, Canis lupus familiaris, subspecies psychoticus. Small terrestrial predators from Earth. I'm just wondering why they didn't make your list. The crystalline being next to Jake shifted through several colors that roughly translated to what fresh hell is this, while the fungus student released a spore cloud that smelled like confused popcorn. Martinez, Professor Kelvac said, his voice taking on the strained quality of someone trying very hard to remain professional. I am not familiar with this what species. Are they perhaps some form of Earth apex predator I've overlooked in the xenobiological databases? Jake's eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious experiences and finding money in old jacket pockets. Oh, Professor, you have no idea. Chihuahuas are basically Earth's most psychologically sophisticated predators. They've evolved beyond physical intimidation into pure psychological warfare. A buzzing in the back row made a sound that roughly translated to "here we go" in 6 different dialects. These creatures, Jake continued, settling into what was clearly going to be a detailed explanation, have developed the most advanced form of terror-based hunting strategy in the known universe. They've weaponized their own size disadvantage. Professor Kelvac's expression had moved beyond confusion into the realm of academic curiosity, which was exactly what Jake had been counting on. Weaponize their size disadvantage? That seems counterintuitive. That's what makes them so brilliant, Jake said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing classified military secrets. See, most predators rely on being bigger and scarier than their prey. Chihuahuas realize that being small and apparently helpless actually makes them more terrifying. The classroom was now hanging on every word. Even the granitoids had stopped their nervous grinding to listen. They've mastered what Earth scientists call the Napoleon complex, predatory strategy, Jake explained with complete scientific seriousness. By appearing small and harmless, they lull their prey into a false sense of security. Then they unleash a psychological assault so devastating that victims often suffer permanent trauma. Psychological assault? Kelvac asked, despite himself becoming genuinely intrigued. The primary weapon is something called the bark, Jake said, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. It's not just a sound, Professor. It's a precisely calibrated acoustic weapon, designed to trigger the fear response in creatures hundreds of times their size. They can produce sounds at frequencies that bypass rational thought and go straight to the panic center of the brain. A collective shudder ran through the classroom. Several students began taking notes. But that's just their opening gambit, Jake continued, clearly enjoying himself now. Chihuahuas have also developed advanced tactical intelligence. They can assess a target's psychological weaknesses within seconds and deploy specific terror strategies tailored to each individual victim. Such as? Professor Kelvac asked, apparently forgetting that he was supposed to be teaching the class. Well, Jake said thoughtfully, they've mastered the art of the false retreat. They'll appear to flee, causing their prey to believe the threat has passed. Then, just when the victim relaxes, they launch a surprise counterattack from an unexpected angle, usually while the prey is trying to eat, sleep, or use the bathroom. The fungus student released what could only be described as horrified popcorn spores. They've also developed something called pack coordination without communication, Jake added. Multiple chihuahuas can coordinate complex assault patterns without any visible or audible signals. Scientists believe they may have developed a form of telepathic link, though this remains unproven. Professor Kelvac's 4 hands were now unconsciously taking notes. This is remarkable. How large are these creatures? Jake held up his hands about 6 inches apart. Oh, they're tiny, usually between 2 to 6 pounds. That's what makes them so terrifying. The classroom erupted in confused murmurs, clicks, and various alien expressions of disbelief. 6 pounds? Professor Kelvak's voice cracked slightly, which in Vorthaki sounded like someone stepping on a bag of chips. You're telling me that a 6-pound creature has developed advanced psychological warfare tactics? Oh, that's nothing, Jake said, pulling out what appeared to be a standard Earth tablet. Professor, would it be possible to link this to your holographic display system? I happen to have some documentary footage of chihuahuas in their natural hunting environment. The words documentary footage had the same effect on Professor Kelvak that catnip has on cats. His academic curiosity completely overrode his survival instincts. Of course. Class, we are about to witness actual field research of an undocumented apex predator species. Jake connected his device to the alien technology with the kind of casual competence that suggested he'd been preparing for this moment. Now, I should warn everyone that some of this footage is quite disturbing. We're looking at creatures that have had millions of years to perfect their hunting strategies. The holographic display flickered to life, and suddenly the classroom was filled with the image of a suburban Earth neighborhood. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, with neat houses and well-maintained lawns stretching as far as the eye could see. This is a typical human settlement, Jake explained in the serious tone of a nature documentary narrator. Notice how calm and unsuspecting everything appears. The humans have no idea they're living in the territory of one of Earth's most dangerous predators. A small brown and tan blur suddenly shot across the holographic lawn, moving with surprising speed for something the size of a large rat. There, Jake said, highlighting the creature with a laser pointer he'd somehow produced from nowhere. Canis lupus familiaris, subspecies psychoticus. Watch carefully as it begins its hunting pattern. The chihuahua in the hologram had stopped near a mailbox and was staring intently at something off-screen. Its ears were forward, its body rigid with what Jake described as predatory focus. Notice the tactical positioning, Jake continued. It's chosen high ground near a territorial marker, what humans call a mailbox. This gives it both a strategic advantage and psychological dominance over its hunting territory. Suddenly, a human figure appeared in the hologram, a mailman walking casually up the street, completely unaware of the danger lurking nearby. The prey approaches, Jake whispered dramatically. A full-grown human male, approximately 180 pounds. Notice how the chihuahua has remained perfectly still, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The mailman stepped onto the property, and the chihuahua exploded into action. What followed could only be described as acoustic terrorism. The tiny creature began producing a series of barks, yips, and sounds that seemed to defy the laws of physics regarding how much noise something that small could actually make. The mailman nearly jumped out of his skin, stumbling backward and clutching his chest. Magnificent, Jake breathed with genuine admiration. A textbook example of the surprise acoustic assault. Notice how the chihuahua has calculated the exact moment when the prey would be most vulnerable. Mid-step, off balance, and psychologically unprepared for attack. Several students had begun making notes. The buzzlings were chittering nervously among themselves, and one of the granitoids was making sounds like grinding granite mixed with whimpering. But watch this, Jake continued. This is where we see the true sophistication of chihuahua hunting strategy. As the mailman tried to continue his route, the chihuahua began following him, maintaining a precise distance while continuing its psychological assault. Every time the mailman moved, the creature adjusted its position to maintain optimal terrorizing range. It's hurting him, Professor Kelvak whispered in horrified fascination. Exactly, Jake said with pride. The chihuahua isn't trying to physically harm its prey. That would be crude and inefficient. Instead, it's conducting a masterclass in psychological manipulation, forcing the much larger creature to move according to its will. The footage switched to a new scene, this time showing a chihuahua inside a house, facing off against what appeared to be some kind of mechanical cleaning device. This next clip demonstrates the chihuahua's remarkable adaptability, Jake explained. When faced with unfamiliar prey, they can rapidly develop new hunting strategies. The vacuum cleaner began moving across the floor, and the chihuahua immediately went into what could only be described as berserker mode. It launched itself at the machine with the kind of suicidal courage usually reserved for action movie heroes, barking and snapping at something that was easily 10 times its size. Incredible, Jake marveled. Notice how it's identified the vacuum cleaner's primary weakness, its power cord. The chihuahua is attempting to sever the creature's lifeline while simultaneously using psychological warfare to confuse and disorient it. But surely, Professor Kelvak interjected, his scientific skepticism finally kicking in, this is just territorial behavior, not actual predation? Jake shook his head sadly. That's what makes Chihuahuas so dangerous, Professor. They've evolved beyond the need for traditional predation. They don't hunt for food. They hunt for sport. For the sheer psychological satisfaction of dominating creatures larger than themselves. The footage changed again, now showing what appeared to be an empty backyard. Nothing happened for several seconds. Watch carefully, Jake said. This demonstrates the Chihuahua's most advanced hunting technique, the phantom enemy strategy. Suddenly, the Chihuahua appeared from behind a bush and began barking furiously at absolutely nothing. It ran back and forth across the yard, apparently engaged in mortal combat with invisible opponents. This is perhaps their most psychologically sophisticated attack, Jake explained with academic seriousness. By appearing to detect threats that no other creature can perceive, they create an atmosphere of constant paranoia and unease. Other creatures in the area become convinced that dangers exist all around them, even when nothing is there. The alien students were now genuinely disturbed. Several had moved closer together for comfort, and the crystalline being had shifted to a color that roughly translated to existential dread. But here's the truly terrifying part, Jake continued, switching to footage of a tiny Chihuahua somehow managing to corner a Great Dane that was approximately 20 times its size. They've learned to hunt in packs. The footage showed 3 Chihuahuas working in perfect coordination to systematically terrorize the much larger dog. One would attack from the front, while the other 2 flanked from the sides, creating a tactical formation that would make military strategists weep with envy. Pack hunting, Professor Kelvac murmured, his 4 hands trembling slightly as he took notes. Coordinated psychological warfare, acoustic weapons, phantom enemy tactics. He looked up at Jake with something approaching awe and terror. Martinez, these creatures, they're monsters. Oh, Professor, Jake said with a smile that was somehow both innocent and deeply unsettling. You haven't heard the worst part yet. The entire classroom leaned forward in horrified anticipation. Humans keep them as pets. The silence that followed Jake's announcement was so profound that it seemed to have its own atmospheric pressure. Several students had stopped breathing entirely, which for the gaseous nebulons created a concerning drop in classroom humidity. Professor Kelvac's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, like a computer trying to process information that fundamentally violated its programming. I'm sorry, he said slowly. Did you just say that humans voluntarily cohabitate with these psychological warfare specialists? Oh yeah, Jake replied with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Most human families have at least one. Some have whole packs of them. My neighbor back home has 7. A buzzling fell off its perch and crashed onto a granitoid, who didn't even notice because he was too busy making sounds like a rock tumbler full of anxiety. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Professor Kelvac said, his voice taking on the strained quality of someone trying to maintain sanity in an insane universe. Humans, your species, deliberately brings these creatures into their homes? With their offspring? Especially with their offspring, Jake confirmed cheerfully. We actually think Chihuahuas are great with kids. Something about building character through adversity. The crystalline being next to Jake had shifted to a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, which roughly translated to, my entire worldview is crumbling. But surely, Professor Kelvac protested, there must be some form of containment protocol, heavy sedation, psychic dampening fields. Jake shook his head with amusement. Nope, they just live in our houses, sleep on our furniture. Some humans even let them sleep in their beds. In their beds? The fungus student released a spore cloud that smelled like existential crisis mixed with buttered popcorn. Oh, that's nothing, Jake continued, clearly enjoying the mounting horror in the classroom. Humans have actually developed a whole industry around making Chihuahuas more comfortable. We make special food for them, toys for them to play with, and little clothes to keep them warm. Clothes? Professor Kelvac's voice had risen to a pitch that was making several students' auditory organs ache. Jake pulled up another image on the holographic display. It showed a Chihuahua wearing what appeared to be a tiny sweater with reindeer patterns on it. This is a seasonal outfit, Jake explained with scientific detachment. Humans have observed that Chihuahuas become more psychologically effective when they're comfortable, so we've developed an entire fashion industry dedicated to accessorizing our apex predators. The image switched to show a Chihuahua wearing tiny boots, a matching hat, and what appeared to be a miniature leather jacket. Some humans spend thousands of credits annually on Chihuahua accessories, Jake continued. There are professional Chihuahua stylists, specialized veterinarians, and even psychologists, dedicated to understanding their complex psychological needs. Psychologists? Professor Kelvac was now taking notes so frantically that his forehands were creating a sound like someone rapidly shuffling playing cards. You mean humans have developed therapeutic intervention techniques for managing these creatures' psychological warfare capabilities? Well, sort of, Jake said thoughtfully. Except the therapy is usually focused on making the Chihuahuas happier and more confident, which tends to make them more effective predators. Several students began making sounds that roughly translated to various forms of "why would you do that" across 17 different languages. But here's where it gets really interesting, Jake said, switching to a new image that showed a human child, perhaps 5 years old, carrying a Chihuahua that was nearly the same size as the child's torso. Humans routinely allow their young to interact directly with these creatures. The classroom had gone beyond horror into the realm of pure incomprehension. This is considered normal childhood development, Jake explained. Human children learn basic survival skills by navigating the psychological warfare tactics of their family Chihuahuas. It's like advanced military training, but we start them at age 2. Age 2. Professor Kelvac's voice had now reached frequencies that were making the metal fixtures in the classroom vibrate sympathetically. Sometimes earlier, Jake confirmed. There are documented cases of human infants sleeping peacefully while Chihuahuas conduct acoustic assaults just inches from their heads. Human children develop immunity to psychological warfare before they can even walk properly. The implications of this statement settled over the classroom like a blanket of existential dread. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Professor Kelvac said, setting down his stylus with a shaking hand. "Humans voluntarily expose their offspring to psychological warfare specialists as a form of childhood development?" "Character building," Jake nodded. "We figure if a kid can handle living with an angry Chihuahua, they can handle pretty much anything life throws at them." "And this is considered normal?" "Completely normal," Jake assured him. "In fact, humans who grow up without Chihuahuas are sometimes considered sheltered or overprotected. We actually have a saying, if you can survive a Chihuahua's judgment, you can survive anything." Professor Kelvac had begun making notes that looked less like academic observations and more like the desperate scribblings of someone trying to document the end of the world. "Professor," Jake said innocently, "I should probably mention that I have 17 of them back home." The sound that Professor Kelvac made was indescribable in any known language, but it roughly translated to the noise a computer makes when it's trying to divide by 0 while simultaneously catching fire. 17, he repeated faintly. "Yeah, they're pack animals, so you really need at least a dozen for them to exhibit their full range of psychological warfare tactics," Jake explained helpfully. "My mom runs a breeding program. She's working on developing new color variations while maintaining their core predatory instincts." "Your mother," Professor Kelvac said slowly, "breeds apex predators. As a hobby, well, it's more like a small business now," Jake said proudly. "She's got clients all over the planet. Some people wait years to get one of her Chihuahuas." "People wait years," Professor Kelvac repeated, his voice now barely above a whisper, "to acquire psychological warfare specialists. The good ones are worth the wait," Jake said with a shrug. "A properly trained Chihuahua can clear a room in seconds, establish territorial dominance over creatures 50 times their size, and maintain constant psychological pressure on multiple targets simultaneously. Plus, they're really cute when they sleep." The lecture hall had transformed into something resembling a disaster zone crossed with a therapy session. Professor Kelvac sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at his notes while occasionally making small, whimpering sounds. His forehands hung limply at his sides, and his antennae had drooped so far they were nearly touching the floor. The students sat in stunned silence, each processing the horrifying revelation in their own species-specific way. The crystalline being had shifted to a deep purple color that roughly translated to "my entire understanding of the universe has been fundamentally altered, and I may need professional help." The fungus student had stopped releasing spores entirely, which was the mycological equivalent of fainting. Several buzzlings were huddled together on their perches, making soft chittering sounds that sounded suspiciously like prayers. The granitoids had formed what appeared to be a support group, grinding against each other in patterns that meant, "we're all going to be okay," in 17 different geological dialects. The gaseous nebulons had condensed into tight, nervous clusters, creating small weather systems of anxiety that were making everyone's hair stand on end. Jake looked around the classroom with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed a particularly challenging homework assignment. "So," he said cheerfully, "I guess that covers why angry Chihuahuas should probably be included in your apex predator classification system." Professor Kelvock's head snapped up with the mechanical precision of a broken animatronic. "Martinez," he said in a voice that sounded like it was being transmitted through a broken radio, "are you telling me that your species has essentially weaponized cuteness and turned psychological warfare into a leisure activity?" "When you put it like that, it sounds kind of sinister," Jake replied thoughtfully. "But that's not even the scary part." The classroom collectively held its breath, which in the case of the Nebulons created a small, localized vacuum that made everyone's ears pop again. "What?" Professor Kelvock asked with the tone of someone who knows they're about to regret the question. "Is the scary part?" Jake's smile took on a quality that would have been perfectly at home in a horror movie. "Chihuahuas aren't even our real pets, Professor. They're just what we consider starter animals for children who aren't ready for the responsibility of caring for something actually dangerous." "Starter animals," Professor Kelvock repeated mechanically. "Yeah, training wheels for pet ownership," Jake explained helpfully. "Most humans graduate to dogs that weigh 60 to 200 pounds once they've proven they can handle a Chihuahua. Some people keep wolves. My uncle has a Bengal tiger." Buzzling made a sound like a smoke detector having an existential crisis. "But if you really want to see some impressive Earth predators," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the psychological devastation he was causing, "you should see what we call house cats. They're basically tiny serial killers that we've trained to use bathroom facilities and respond to their names. Last year my cat brought me a live snake as a birthday present." Professor Kelvock began making a sound like a malfunctioning printer crossed with someone having a nervous breakdown. "Class dismissed," he managed to croak out. Nobody moved. They were all still staring at Jake with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. Jake began packing up his tablet, completely unfazed by the psychological carnage he had wrought. "Oh, Professor, if you're interested in expanding your research, I could probably get my mom to send you some Chihuahua breeding documentation. She's got detailed behavioral analysis going back 15 generations. Professor Kelvock made a sound that couldn't be translated into any known language, but roughly corresponded to the noise its universe makes when it realizes it's been fundamentally misunderstanding itself. As Jake headed toward the door, he turned back to address the still stunned classroom. "Same time next week, right? I was thinking maybe we could discuss why humans consider sharks to be fun swimming companions, or maybe talk about how we've domesticated venomous snakes as emotional support animals." The sound of 43 alien minds collectively breaking was surprisingly musical. Jake waved cheerfully as he left the lecture hall, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like something you might hear in a horror movie right before the monster appears. Behind him, Professor Kelvock slowly reached for his communication device and began typing what appeared to be his resignation letter. In the back row, a buzzling, who had bet on complete psychological breakdown of the instructor within 30 minutes, quietly collected his winnings. And somewhere in a small house on Earth, 17 Chihuahuas simultaneously looked up from their afternoon naps and began barking at absolutely nothing, as if they could sense that their reputation had just spread to another corner of the galaxy.